I'm Molly Walsh, 33 years old, a captain in the United States Army, and I never thought the fortress I bled to build would become the target of my own family's plunder. After years of hardship to achieve what I have today, my parents and my sister, Serafina, reappeared after 5 years of silence, demanding I sell my home to pay off her $260,000 debt. When I refused, they did the unthinkable. They broke in and destroyed my home, leaving the words, "You traitor," scrawled across my wall. What they didn't know is that this house holds secrets that will ultimately protect me from their schemes. Before I tell you what that secret is, let me know where you're watching from today. And please hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to defend yourself from toxic relatives who suddenly needed something from you. My house in Fayetteville, North Carolina, is nothing extravagant. It's a modest, single-story bungalow, painted a clean white with pleasant blue shutters on the windows. But it's mine. Every square foot of it, every blade of grass in the yard was paid for with overseas deployments, sleepless nights on watch, and the kind of steel-forged discipline the Army drills into you. It's more than a house, it's a declaration of independence. That particular Saturday afternoon was warm and humid, the air thick with the smell of freshly cut grass and impending summer rain. I was in my backyard, my hands deep in the rich soil, trying to wrestle a new wooden trellis into place for my burgeoning tomato plants. The wood was rough against my palms, a grounding, tangible feeling. This was the life I had built, brick by brick, seed by seed. Quiet, orderly, predictable. Just as I managed to get the trellis standing upright, a familiar, gentle voice drifted over the fence. "Looks like you've got your hands full there." It was Mrs. Eleanor Vance, my next-door neighbor. She's a kind, widowed woman of 75, with a smile that could calm a hurricane and the innate warmth of a true Southern matriarch. She walked over, her step careful on the grass, carrying a small potted plant with glossy green leaves and a single, perfect white blossom. A camellia. "For a woman who built her own garden from scratch," she said, her eyes crinkling at the corners. She held it out to me. I wiped the dirt from my hands onto my jeans and accepted the gift, a simple, uncomplicated warmth spreading through my chest. It was a feeling I'd never once known back in Havenwood, Pennsylvania. That grim Rust Belt town where I grew up, a place where dreams went to die alongside the steel mills. Here, in my small patch of North Carolina, I felt seen. I felt safe. This was my life now. And I loved it more than words could say. It was in that precise moment of peace that the spell was broken. My phone, sitting on the patio table, began to ring. It wasn't my usual ringtone. It was an old, tinny melody I'd forgotten to delete, one assigned to a specific group of contacts years ago as a warning. The screen lit up with a single, 3-letter word. Mom. 5 years. 5 years of absolute, deafening silence. My heart didn't just drop. It seized. A cold shock, electric and sharp, shot through my veins. Every instinct, honed by years of military training to detect an incoming threat, screamed at me. My posture straightened. My breathing automatically shifted, a slow, controlled inhale, a long, steady exhale. It was the same technique I used before a mission briefing, the same way I centered myself before stepping into a hostile environment. I picked up the phone, my thumb hovering over the green icon. This wasn't a call. It was a breach. "Hello?" My voice was calm, level. An officer's voice. On the other end, the response was anything but. My mother, Genevieve, her voice dripping with a sweetness as thick and artificial as cough syrup. "Molly, honey, it's been so long. I was just thinking about you and wanted to see how my girl was doing. Your father and your sister, they miss you terribly." The lie rolled off her tongue so effortlessly, so smoothly, it was almost impressive. As if she'd spent the last 5 years rehearsing it. As if we hadn't last spoken in a screaming match that ended with my father telling me I was a disgrace. I kept my guard up, my answers short. "I'm fine. Just fine. Oh, honey." But my mother is a master tactician in her own right. Her battlefield is guilt. Her weapons are passive aggression and feigned concern. She launched her campaign, starting with a volley of carefully crafted complaints. Dad's back was acting up again. You know how it is. Serafina was struggling with her boutique. It's so hard for an artist to make a living in a small town. The old house in Havenwood was practically falling apart, the leaky roof, the drafty windows. Each detail was a baited hook cast into the water to see what I'd bite. I didn't. I just listened, my silence a stone wall. Finally, she got to the point. The real objective of the mission. It would just mean the world to us if you came home for dinner, she pleaded, her voice cracking with manufactured emotion. Just one reunion dinner. We're family, after all. That word, family. In her mouth, it wasn't an invitation. It was a threat, a life sentence. The soldier in my head was shouting, "It's an ambush! Do not engage!" I knew it was a trap. I knew, with every fiber of my being, that I should say no, hang up, and block the number forever. But then another voice whispered from a deeper, more wounded place inside me. The voice of a little girl who just wanted her mother to be proud of her. A weak, foolish part of me that still harbored a toxic sliver of hope. Maybe this time it'll be different. Maybe they've changed. It's an illusion that so many of us cling to. The desperate belief that the people who hurt us will magically wake up one day and decide to love us right. The silence stretched. I could hear her breathing, waiting. She knew she had me. All right, I finally sighed, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. I hated myself for my weakness, for surrendering terrain I'd fought so hard to win. This weekend, I'll drive up. After I hung up, a profound chill ran down my spine, a cold dread that had nothing to do with the weather. My sanctuary suddenly felt vulnerable, exposed. Mrs. Eleanor was looking at me, her kind face filled with a quiet understanding she didn't need words to express. "You all right, dear?" she asked softly. I forced a nod, squaring my shoulders and trying to project a strength I didn't feel. "I'm fine, ma'am. Thank you." I managed a tight smile. "It's just dinner. I can handle it." But as the words left my lips, I knew they were a lie I was telling myself. The biggest lie of all. I wasn't going home for a family dinner. I was returning to an old battlefield, and I had just willingly walked into the kill zone. The 5-hour drive north from Fayetteville to Havenwood felt like a journey back in time, each mile stripping away a layer of the life I had built, leaving me exposed. The moment I pulled onto my old street, the familiar weight of the place settled on me like a damp woolen blanket. Nothing had changed. The same tired houses with sagging porches, the same gray sky that seemed permanently bruised. My childhood home looked exactly as I remembered it, only more so. More worn down. The paint was peeling, revealing the weathered wood beneath like old bones. Fine cracks spiderwebbed across the walls, and the air inside was thick with the heavy, cloying smell of dampness and decay. It was the smell of stagnation. My father, Thaddeus, was sunk deep into his throne, a worn-out, lazy boy recliner that had molded to the shape of his body over decades. He didn't look up from the Steelers game blaring from the old box TV. In his hand was a bottle of Iron City beer, its brown glass sweating onto his fingers. He just grunted, a flick of his chin the only acknowledgement of my existence. 5 years, and that was all I got. My sister, Serafina, was draped over the sofa, looking bored. At 38, she still dressed like she was trying to get cast in a high school play, wearing ripped jeans and a band t-shirt for a group that broke up before she was born. Her eyes, glued to her phone, didn't even register my arrival. Dinner was a silent, tense affair. The meal itself was a testament to my mother's apathy. A pot roast cooked until it was gray and stringy, served with a side of instant mashed potatoes that tasted like cardboard flakes. No one asked me about my life. Not a single question about my work, my deployments, the countries I'd seen, the person I had become. The only sounds were the drone of the football commentators, the scrape of forks against plates, and the endless stream of complaints from my father about the referees. Serafina occasionally sighed dramatically, sharing some vapid detail about her artistic vision. I sat among them, a ghost at their table, completely invisible. The hope that had foolishly flickered in my heart on the drive up was now extinguished, leaving behind only cold ash. The main act began with dessert, a store-bought apple pie, its crust pale and doughy. My mother, Genevieve, cleared the plates, and when she returned, her face was arranged into a mask of maternal sorrow. She sat down next to me and took my hand. Her skin was cold. Her eyes welled up with practiced tears. "Molly, darling," she began, her voice a fragile whisper. "Your sister, Serafina, she's so incredibly talented, a true artist. But she's in a bit of trouble, a big bit of trouble." She squeezed my hand. "Her boutique, it's in debt. $260,000. The number hung in the air, obscene and absurd. At that moment, as if on cue, my father muted the TV. The sudden silence was more jarring than the noise. He turned his head slowly, his gaze heavy and flat. "That house of yours in North Carolina," he said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "Sell it. That should cover it." There was no negotiation. No, could you possibly consider? It wasn't a request. It was an order. They had discussed it, planned it, and decided the fate of my property, the one thing in the world that was truly mine, all without me. I wasn't their daughter, I was their contingency plan. Their walking, talking ATM. A cold, sharp anger, unlike anything I'd felt in years, rose from the pit of my stomach. It wasn't hot and explosive, it was glacial. I pulled my hand away from my mother's grasp. "No," I said. My voice was quiet, steady, and terrifyingly calm. The word detonated in the small dining room. Serafina's fork clattered onto her plate. "No. Did you just say no?" Her voice rose, shrill with disbelief. "Do you have any idea what it's like to be stuck in this dead-end town, trying to create something beautiful while you get to gallivant around the world on the government's dime?" My mother rushed in to play peacemaker, her words a volley of guilt. "Don't be selfish, Molly. You've gotten to see the world. Your sister hasn't even been out of Pennsylvania. This is her one big chance. Family is supposed to help each other." She wielded the word family like a bludgeon, a justification for any demand, no matter how outrageous. But it was my father's words that finally shattered the last, lingering shard of my childhood illusions. He pushed himself up from his recliner, his face flushed with rage. He pointed a trembling finger at me. "Don't you get high and mighty with me," he snarled, his voice thick with resentment. "That fancy uniform doesn't hide where you came from. You owe this house. You owe this family. You either sell that house, or you're no daughter of mine." The toxic hope inside me finally died, and in its place, something hardened. I stood up, my chair scraping against the linoleum floor. I looked him directly in the eye, seeing him not as my father, but as the tyrant he had always been. "I don't owe anyone in this room a single thing," I said, my voice as cold and hard as steel. "I paid my debts with my entire childhood." I turned my back on them and walked toward the door, their stunned silence quickly erupting into a cacophony of insults and curses behind me. I didn't flinch. I just kept walking, out the door, down the cracked concrete steps, and into the cool night air. As I drove away, the car's headlights cutting the Worcester through the darkness of the forgotten street, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The house, with its dim, yellow light spilling from the windows, grew smaller and smaller until it was just another I drove through the night on Interstate 80, putting Pennsylvania in my rearview mirror for what I knew was the final time. The headlights of oncoming trucks sliced through the darkness of my cabin, flashing across my face like ghosts from the past rushing to meet me. Each pulse of light brought another memory. Another reason why my answer had to be no. Why couldn't I give in? Why was $260,000 a line I would never cross? Because it was never about the money. It was about what that money represented. It was the blood, the sweat, and the 15 years of my life I had traded for my freedom. My father's words echoed in my head, a relentless drumbeat against my skull. "You owe this family." But the real debt, the one that could never be repaid, was the one they owed me, for a stolen childhood. The memories flooded back then, Not as hazy recollections, but as sharp, vivid scenes playing out on the dark screen of the windshield. I remember being 12 years old. It was a Tuesday. I was helping my mother clear the table, and my elbow caught the edge of a cheap ceramic vase she kept on the mantelpiece. It wasn't an antique, it wasn't valuable, but it was hers. The sound of it shattering on the floor was like a gunshot in the silent house. My father, Thaddeus, was in the room in an instant. He didn't yell. It was worse than yelling. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my bicep, and dragged me down the creaking wooden stairs to the basement. He forced me to my knees on the cold, unforgiving concrete floor and told me to stay there until he said I could move. He shut the door, plunging me into near darkness. All night, I knelt on that floor, my knees aching, the cold seeping into my bones. But the worst part wasn't the physical pain. It was the sounds from upstairs. I could hear my mother's voice, soft and gentle, as she read a bedtime story to Serafina. I heard my sister's laughter, light and carefree, trickling down through the floorboards like tiny sharp knives stabbing me over and over. They were living in a different world, just one floor above me. Hours later, the basement door opened with a soft creak. It was my mother. She snuck down, not to rescue me, but to manage the situation. She pressed a thin, scratchy blanket into my hands. "Hush now, Molly," she whispered, her voice urgent and strained. "Don't make your father angrier." She didn't protect me. She didn't stand up for me. She just told me to endure it quietly, to be a better victim. In that moment, I understood the roles we played. Serafina was the princess in the castle, and I was the scapegoat in the dungeon, sacrificed to appease the tyrant king's unpredictable rage. My mother wasn't a fellow prisoner. She was the warden, ensuring the system ran smoothly. Then there was the year I turned 15. I got a summer job at a local diner, bussing tables and washing dishes. I worked my tail off, scrubbing grease from the floors, enduring the sleazy comments from the line cooks, my hands perpetually smelling of bleach and old coffee grounds. I saved every single dollar, hiding the crumpled bills under my mattress. All for one thing: a $75 ticket to see Pearl Jam. They were my favorite band, their music a lifeline in the suffocating silence of my life. That ticket was the first thing I'd ever truly earned for myself, a small piece of a world that was mine and mine alone. My father found it. I don't know how, but he did. He stormed into my room one afternoon, waving the ticket in his hand like it was evidence of a crime. He held it up in front of my face, and then slowly, deliberately, he tore it into tiny, useless pieces. The confetti of my dreams fluttered to the floor. "This money is for the family," he growled, his voice low and menacing. "Not for you to waste on rock and roll garbage." The following week, he took the rest of the money I'd saved and bought Serafina a shimmering, brand new dress for her sophomore prom. I watched her twirl in front of the mirror, the sequins sparkling, and felt nothing. The grief was gone, replaced by a hollow certainty. That night, I cried not for the concert I had lost, but for the devastating realization that I was not entitled to joy. Any happiness I found would have to be seized, defended, and fought for. School became my only refuge. My grades were my shield and my sword. I studied with the desperation of a drowning person clinging to a piece of driftwood. Every A on my report card was a small act of rebellion, a step further away from the life they had planned for me. The day I graduated from high school, while my classmates were planning keg parties and road trips, I put on my best jeans and walked downtown to the military recruitment office. The plate glass window was covered in posters. One, in particular, caught my eye. It was a picture of a soldier in crisp dress uniform, looking strong and resolute. Above the image were the words, "Army, be all you can be." For most kids from my town, it was a last resort, a way out of unemployment. For me, it was a promise of salvation. It was an invitation to become someone else, somewhere else, someone defined not by what I could give them, but by what I could achieve on my own. And if you've ever had a moment like that, a turning point where you knew you had to escape to survive, please support this story by hitting the like button. Let me know in the comments what your recruitment poster was, that one thing that promised you a way out. I walked through that glass door without a moment's hesitation. It wasn't a choice, it was an escape. The Army gave me discipline and a steady paycheck, but it was up to me to build a life. After a few deployments between combat pay and living frugally in the barracks, I had managed to save a respectable amount of money. Instead of blowing it on a new car or expensive vacations, I invested it in my freedom. I went looking for a house. I found it in Fayetteville, a foreclosed property the bank was desperate to get off its books. It was a wreck. The paint was peeling, the floors were water damaged, and a musty smell clung to every room. But beneath the neglect, I saw good bones. I saw potential. Most importantly, I saw a blank canvas. Every weekend, every day of leave became dedicated to the resurrection of that little bungalow. I learned how to tile a bathroom floor from YouTube tutorials, pausing the video every 30 seconds to match the instructor's movements. A retired master sergeant from my unit, who'd started his own plumbing business, taught me how to sweat copper pipes over a six-pack of beer on a Saturday afternoon. I learned to hang drywall, spackle, and paint. Every nail I hammered, every coat of paint I rolled onto the walls wasn't just about fixing a house. It was about healing myself. With each deliberate, constructive action, I was reclaiming the parts of my soul that had been chipped away, proving to myself that I could build something beautiful and lasting out of ruins. But a house is just a structure. What truly began to heal me was learning to trust people again. One of the best decisions I ever made was signing up to volunteer with the local Habitat for Humanity chapter on my weekends off. Alongside a group of strangers, teachers, accountants, mechanics, we'd spend our Saturdays framing walls and raising roofs for low-income families. Out there, sweating under the North Carolina sun, I wasn't Captain Walsh. I was just Molly, the clumsy amateur with the power drill. For the first time in my life, I was part of a team working toward a common goal where there was no judgment, no hidden agenda, no simmering rage. There was just shared purpose and easy camaraderie. I learned that the kindness of strangers was real. It wasn't a transaction, it was a gift. It was during those long drives to the build sites that I started listening to podcasts. Someone recommended Brené Brown. I listened to her talk about vulnerability and courage, and one of her phrases hit me like a ton of bricks. Vulnerability is not weakness, it's our greatest measure of courage. I realized that what I was doing, building a new life from scratch, opening myself up to new people, daring to believe I deserved peace, wasn't just an act of survival. It was an act of profound courage. It was the bravest thing I had ever done. And then there was Mrs. Eleanor. The day I moved in, she was the first person to walk across her lawn and knock on my door. She brought with her a homemade sweet potato pie, its crust perfectly golden, the warm smell of cinnamon and nutmeg filling my empty entryway. It was more than a pie, it was a welcome. It was an acceptance. She never once asked about my past, never pried about why a single woman in the Army was buying a fixer-upper all by herself. But she was always there. We'd spend quiet afternoons in our respective gardens, calling out tips to each other over the fence. We'd sit on her porch swing, sipping sweet tea from tall glasses as she told me stories about her late husband, Harold, and his terrible fishing jokes. She gave me something my own mother never could: unconditional, uncomplicated care. She saw me, not as a resource to be used, but as a person to be valued. Between my battle buddies in my unit, the friends I made at Habitat, and Mrs. Eleanor, I had built something far more important than a house. I had built a new family. A found family, bound not by blood but by mutual respect and genuine affection. This was my fortress of peace, and every person in it was a brick in its walls. That night, after the long, soul-crushing drive back from Havenwood, I sat alone in my living room. The warm yellow light from the lamp I'd rewired myself cast a gentle glow on the walls I'd painted a soft, calming blue. I looked around at my home, my fortress, my sanctuary. Every book on the shelf, every photo on the wall was a testament to the fact that I had survived my past, that I had won. A deep, profound sense of peace washed over me, the kind of peace you can only appreciate after years of war. I took a deep breath. The air clean and tasting of freedom. I was safe. And just as that thought crossed my mind, My phone buzzed on the coffee table. It lit up, displaying a number I didn't recognize, an unknown caller. But I knew. My soldier's intuition, the same one that had kept me alive in dusty foreign lands, screamed a single, silent warning. The fight wasn't over. They had found me. The storm I had outrun for so long was about to make landfall, right here, on the shores of my hard-won peace. The assault didn't begin with a knock on the door, or a voice shouting in the night. It began silently, digitally, with the subtle, insidious ping of a notification on my phone. A name from my past, a high school acquaintance I hadn't spoken to in over a decade, had tagged me in a post on Facebook. My finger hovered over the notification, a sense of dread coiling in my stomach like a cold snake. This was it, the opening salvo. I clicked it. And there it was, Serafina's masterpiece of manipulation. The post was built around a photograph of the two of us as children, a faded snapshot from a forgotten summer. I was maybe 9, she was 14. We were sitting on the splintered wooden steps of our front porch in Havenwood, squinting into the sun. I had a gap-toothed, goofy grin, and my arm was slung awkwardly around her shoulder. She had the self-conscious, slightly pained smile of a teenager forced to pose with her annoying little sister. We looked innocent. We looked happy. We looked like a family from a greeting card. The image was a carefully chosen lie, a Trojan horse designed to make what came next seem all the more tragic, and my supposed betrayal all the more monstrous. Beneath the photo was a novel-length caption, a masterclass in passive-aggressive martyrdom. She wrote in flowing, dramatic prose about her artistic soul being slowly crushed by the harsh, unfeeling realities of small-town life. She lamented the unfortunate series of events and bad luck that led to her financial troubles, framing her irresponsibility as a noble struggle. And then, after paragraphs of self-pity, she delivered the payload. She never mentioned my name, of course. That would have been too direct, too honest. Instead, she wrote vaguely about the unique pain of having a highly successful sister in the military, who, sadly, had been changed by her career. A sister who had developed a heart of stone and now tragically valued money and possessions more than her own family. It was brilliant in its cruelty, a perfectly executed character assassination. The comment section beneath was a waterfall of misplaced sympathy and faux outrage from her circle of friends and distant relatives. So sorry you're going through this, honey. I can't believe family would treat you that way. Sending prayers and positive vibes. With one calculated post, they had successfully painted me as the villain of my own story, turning my years of sacrifice into evidence of my cold, unfeeling nature. They were trying me in the court of public opinion, and they had supplied a jury of clueless strangers who were now clucking their tongues in judgment of a woman they had never met. My private pain was now a public spectacle. The digital assault was the air support. The ground invasion followed shortly after. The phone calls started. My mother, Genevieve, would call me, sobbing, her voice thick with a theatrical anguish she could summon on command. She'd wail about how my selfishness was breaking her heart, how my callousness was putting a strain on my father's already weak health, effectively killing him. She weaponized her religion, hissing scripture and condemnation through the phone. God does not forgive a disrespectful child, Molly, she'd cry, her voice trembling with righteous fury, before hanging up in a dramatic flourish that left silence ringing in my ear. My father never called. He preferred the cold efficiency of text messages. They arrived at random intervals, short, blunt, and menacing, like digital punches to the gut. You'll regret this. I know where you live. Each message was a small grenade tossed into the peace of my day. Every ring of my phone, every buzz of a new text, was a fresh wave of attack. My fortress, my beautiful, quiet house, no longer felt safe. It felt like a target on a map. They could show up at any moment. The psychological perimeter I'd spent years building was being breached, not by force, but by a relentless, invasive presence that wormed its way into my thoughts and stole my peace. A flicker of panic, cold and familiar, began to creep into my mind. It was the feeling of being that 12-year-old girl again, trapped in the dark basement, hearing the laughter from upstairs. The instinct was to curl up, to hide, to make myself small, and hope the threat would pass. But then, 15 years of training kicked in. A different voice, one forged in the deserts of Afghanistan and the discipline of Fort Bragg, took command. I remembered a core principle from my officer training: situational awareness. You don't react emotionally. You observe, you orient, you decide, and you act. I was no longer that helpless child. I was a captain in the U.S. Army, and my home was under siege. I took a deep, centering breath. I compartmentalized the fear and anger, locking them away to be dealt with later. I began to think tactically. I was in a hostile engagement, and I needed to respond as such. I did not reply to a single text. I did not answer another phone call. Engaging the enemy on their terms would be a strategic error. Instead, I began to gather intelligence. With cold, methodical precision, I screenshotted everything. Serafina's entire Facebook post and the string of judgmental comments. Every threatening text from my father, the call log showing the barrage of harassing calls from my mother. I created a new, password-protected folder on my laptop. I named it Evidence. I wasn't sure what I would use it for, but I knew I was in a fight, and you don't go into a fight unarmed. That night, sleep was impossible. The tranquility of my home had been poisoned. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves skittering across the driveway, sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my ears straining in the darkness, cataloging every sound. They were escalating. I realized their words were not their only weapons. They were a softening up barrage before the real assault. Their next move would be physical. I was sure of it. The next morning, as the first rays of sun cut through my blinds, my fear from the night before had been forged into something harder, something colder. Steel. My resolve had set. I picked up my phone and called a local security company. An hour later, a polite but serious-looking technician named Kevin was walking through my house as I detailed my requirements. "I want the works," I told him, my voice firm and clear, leaving no room for negotiation. A comprehensive system, cameras covering every angle of the exterior, front door, back door, all windows. Motion sensors on all ground floor points of entry. A monitored alarm system with a direct line to the Fayetteville Police Department. The loudest siren you have. He looked at me with a hint of concern in his eyes, taking in my military bearing and the stark emptiness of my still being furnished home. "Ma'am, Captain, are you worried about something?" I met his gaze without blinking, my expression unreadable. "I'm not worried," I said, the words precise and deliberate. "I'm preparing." A few days after the security system was installed, the new doorbell chimed. Its pleasant, electronic tone a stark contrast to the alarm bells ringing in my head. I walked over to the monitor I'd had mounted in the hallway. My blood ran cold. Standing on my porch were my parents. They were perfectly framed by the high-definition camera lens, a portrait of manufactured remorse. My mother had arranged her face into an expression of deep, sorrowful concern. My father stood beside her, looking down at his shoes, the very picture of a humbled man. In his hands, he held a cheap, store-bought gift basket, overflowing with cellophane-wrapped crackers and processed cheese. It was so absurdly transparent, it was almost insulting. My heart hammered against my ribs. My first instinct was to do nothing, to leave them standing there until they withered away under the Carolina sun. But I knew that wouldn't work. If I didn't open the door, they'd cause a scene. They'd bang on the door, shout my name, and perform their grief for the entire neighborhood to see, cementing their narrative of the poor, concerned parents and their cold-hearted daughter. I took a slow, deliberate breath, just as I'd been trained to do. Observe, orient, decide, act. I decided to play their game, but on my turf, by my rules. I unlocked the deadbolt. The heavy, satisfying thunk of the bolt sliding back was a small comfort, and opened the door just enough to block the entrance with my body. I stood there, silent, my posture rigid. "What do you want?" I asked. The words were flat, devoid of emotion. My mother attempted a watery smile. "Can we come in, honey?" "Please, we drove all night. We were so worried." Her voice was a fragile, trembling thing. We were wrong, Molly, so wrong. I am so sorry. The apology was as hollow as a drum, but I stepped aside. Let the enemy into the fortress, where you can watch their every move. I let them in, but my eyes never left them. I was a hawk tracking its prey. They immediately began an uninvited tour of my home, their feigned admiration a thin veil for their true purpose. My father, Thaddeus, wandered through the living room, his boots scuffing the hardwood floors I'd spent a month refinishing. He ran his hand along the walls, tapping them periodically with his knuckles as if testing their structural integrity. He glanced up at the ceiling, at the light fixtures, his eyes cataloging everything. My mother, Genevieve, drifted from one piece of furniture to another, her touch lingering on each surface. She ran a finger over the smooth, polished wood of the coffee table I'd found at a flea market. "Oh, this is a beautiful table," she cooed, her voice laced with a false sweetness. "Must have been expensive, huh?" It wasn't a compliment, it was an appraisal. Then, as if on cue, Serafina emerged from the car they'd left running in my driveway and breezed through the open door. She held up her phone, already snapping pictures. She took a photo of the chandelier, the layout of the kitchen, even a close-up of the new locks on the windows. "Just getting some artistic inspiration," she said with a flippant wave of her hand when she caught me watching her, a smug little smile playing on her lips. But I knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't a visit, it was a reconnaissance mission. They were assessing the value of the asset and probing for weaknesses in my defenses. They were treating me like a fool. And the disrespect was more infuriating than their greed. After their pathetic excuse for an inspection, we all ended up in the living room. The silence was heavy, thick with unspoken hostility. They sat stiffly on my sofa. I remained standing, my arms crossed, a sentry in my own home. Finally, my father broke the silence. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and adopted a tone of magnanimous reasonability. The voice of a man offering a generous compromise. "Look," he said, avoiding my eyes. Maybe us telling you to sell the house was a bit much, a bit hasty." He paused, letting the fake concession hang in the air. "But what if you mortgaged it? You could take out a home equity loan, get the money for your sister, and you still get to keep the house. See? It's a win-win. That's reasonable, right?" I stared at him, my expression unreadable. Their entire strategy was laid bare. They hadn't come here to apologize. They hadn't changed. They had simply regrouped and devised a new line of attack. They wanted me to voluntarily hand them the keys to my financial future, to indebt myself for my sister's irresponsibility so they wouldn't have to go through the trouble of taking it by force. The disgust rose in my throat, hot and acidic. I was done playing. I stood up, walked to the front door, and pulled it wide open. "The visit is over," I said, my voice as cold and hard as polished granite. "My answer is still no. And don't ever come back here again." My father's face went from feigned reasonableness to slack-jawed shock, and then darkened into the familiar, deep red shade of his rage. My mother gasped, grabbing his arm as he started to rise from the couch. "Thaddeus, don't!" She practically dragged him out the door, but just before he crossed the threshold, he turned back to face me. His eyes were small, filled with a venomous, chilling hatred. "You'll regret this, you little bitch," he hissed. The moment they were gone, I slammed the door shut and engaged both the deadbolt and the chain lock. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a surge of pure adrenaline. Have you ever had to be the one to finally close the door on a toxic family member, even when they were trying to pretend they had changed? If you know that feeling, that mix of pain and empowerment, hit that like button to show your support. Let me know in the comments with a simple "door closed" if you've been there. I walked straight to my small office, where the monitor for the new security system was glowing. My heart was still pounding. I hit rewind, and I watched. I watched the footage from the camera above my back window, and I saw my father jiggle the handle, testing the lock. I watched the wide-angle view from the living room, and I saw my mother's eyes darting up to the corner where the camera was mounted. and I watched the crystal clear close-up from the porch camera as Serafina took a detailed photograph of the make and model of my front door's deadbolt. My breath hitched. They hadn't come to make peace. They had come to prepare for an invasion, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that it was coming soon. I was returning from a 3-day field training exercise, feeling exhausted but satisfied. My uniform smelled like pine needles, sweat, and gunpowder. All I wanted was a hot shower and a cold beer. But as I turned onto my street, a primal sense of wrongness hit me first, even before I could process what I was seeing. My soldier's intuition screamed. I saw it from 100 yards away. My front door. It wasn't closed, it was hanging grotesquely open, splintered and broken, clinging to a single hinge like a broken jaw. My heart stopped. The world seemed to slow down, the sounds of the neighborhood fading into a dull roar. Training took over. I pulled my car to the curb, killed the engine, and drew my regulation Glock 19 from its holster in one smooth, practiced motion. I racked the slide, chambering around. My hands were steady. My breathing was controlled. But inside, a cold, white-hot rage was building. I approached the house low and fast, using the familiar cover of my neighbor's hedges. The inside of my home was a war zone. My beautiful, comfortable sofa, the first new piece of furniture I had ever bought for myself, was slashed to ribbons, its white stuffing pulled out like guts. The screen of my television was a spiderweb of shattered glass. My books, my most prized possessions, my paper and ink friends, had been torn from their shelves, their spines broken, pages ripped out and scattered across the floor like fallen leaves. And then I saw the message. Scrawled across the peaceful blue of my living room wall in a garish, greasy slash of bright red lipstick, Serafina's signature shade, were 2 words in crude, looping letters. You, traitor. My sanctuary. My fortress. Violated, desecrated. A floorboard creaked in the back of the house. From my office, they were still here. My grip tightened on my pistol. I moved silently down the hallway, every sense on high alert. I used the techniques they drill into you for clearing a room. Back flat against the wall. Listening. Breathing. Then, in one swift motion, I pivoted and entered the room, weapon at a low ready. And there they were. Vultures caught in the act of picking over a corpse. My father, my mother, and Serafina. They were frantically ransacking my metal filing cabinet, tossing papers everywhere in a desperate, greedy frenzy. They were looking for the deed to my house. The moment they saw me, 3 faces turned, their expressions shifting in a split second from avarice to wide-eyed, slack-jawed panic. "Molly," my mother shrieked, a grotesque, distorted smile plastered on her face as if she could somehow pretend this was all normal. We were just stopping by to see if you were home." The lie was so pathetic, so insulting, it barely registered. Serafina dropped a folder of my financial records, her face as white as a sheet. My father, Thaddeus, recovered first. His fear, a fleeting thing, was quickly consumed by his default emotion, rage. The familiar, brutish anger that had ruled my childhood. "You dare point a gun at me!" he roared, his chest puffing out as he took a belligerent step toward me. "In your own father's face? Put it down!" But I wasn't the 12-year-old girl in the basement anymore. I wasn't the 15-year-old crying over a ripped concert ticket. I stood my ground, my feet planted, the barrel of my weapon still pointed safely at the floor, but held with an authority that left no room for doubt. "Get out of my house," I said. My voice was dangerously quiet. "Now!" This defiance, this utter lack of fear, was something he couldn't comprehend. It drove him into a frenzy. With a guttural roar, he lunged, his hand raised to strike me, the same way he had 1,000 times before. But his rage was slow and clumsy. My training was fast and precise. In a fraction of a second, I moved. I blocked his incoming arm with my forearm, pivoted on the ball of my foot, and used his own momentum to twist his arm up behind his back in a restraining lock. He howled, a mix of pain and shocked disbelief as he was forced to his knees. He struggled, but it was useless. He was strong, but I was skilled. For the first time in my life, The power dynamic between us had irrevocably, physically, shifted. The bully was helpless. The monster had been caged. "Mom, call 911!" Serafina screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria. She was looking at me as if I were the intruder, the aggressor. I released my father, shoving him forward onto the floor. I took a step back, my phone already in my hand. "No need, I've already got it," I said, my voice as cold as ice. My thumb had already pressed the 3 numbers that would change everything. The call was connecting. Absolute silence fell over the room, broken only by my father's heavy breathing. They all stared at me, their faces a mixture of confusion and horror. They couldn't believe it. I had broken the cardinal rule of toxic families. You never, ever air your dirty laundry in public. You protect the system, even as it destroys you. Then, faint at first but growing rapidly louder, came the sound of approaching sirens. The wail cut through the quiet neighborhood, a sound of reckoning. True, unadulterated panic flashed in their eyes. The game was over. 2 Fayetteville police officers entered the wrecked living room moments later, their faces grim as they took in the scene. When they saw the destruction, my uniform, and the 3 intruders, they understood immediately. As an officer snapped handcuffs onto my father's wrists, he twisted his head to glare at me, his face purple with rage. "You're gonna pay for this," he bellowed, his voice echoing in the violated space. But as I watched them being led out of my home, their heads bowed in shame, their pathetic act finally stripped away to reveal the common criminals they were, I knew he was wrong. For the first time in my entire life, it was finally them, not me, who was going to have to pay the price. After the police cruisers pulled away, taking the wreckage of my family with them, an unnerving silence descended upon my house. The adrenaline that had coursed through my veins, sharpening my senses and steadying my hands, drained away, leaving a hollow exhaustion in its wake. I stood in the middle of my ravaged living room and slowly slid down the wall until I was sitting on the floor. I was surrounded by the debris of my life. The initial surge of victory, of righteous power, was gone. They had been arrested, yes. But my fortress had been breached. My sanctuary was in ruins. A profound sense of emptiness washed over me. I had won the battle, but my home felt like a casualty of war. Where could I even begin to pick up the pieces? The next day, Mrs. Eleanor appeared at my broken door, her face a mask of gentle concern. She didn't offer platitudes or ask invasive questions. She simply held out a thermos of hot coffee and a bag of biscuits. A few hours later, 2 of my friends from my Habitat for Humanity crew showed up, toolboxes in hand. They didn't say much. They just started helping me board up the door and clean up the glass. Their quiet, steady presence was a balm on my shattered nerves. We started in the attic, clearing out storage boxes that had been tossed around and broken open. Tucked away in a dusty corner, under a pile of old insulation, I found something I hadn't seen before. A small wooden footlocker, bound with rusted iron straps. It must have belonged to the previous owner. I had never bothered to open it. Driven by a flicker of curiosity in the midst of my despair, I carried it downstairs. I pried open the corroded latch with the edge of a screwdriver. The hinges groaned in protest. Inside there was no treasure, no hidden valuables, just a thick manila folder of yellowed, brittle documents. I carefully lifted them out. They were the original papers for the house, dating back nearly a century. There were old property deeds, architectural blueprints, and a stack of correspondence. One letter, on the official letterhead of the Fayetteville Historic Preservation Society, caught my eye. My gaze fell on a single, underlined sentence in the middle of the page. Be it resolved that the property at 12 Oak Street is hereby officially designated a town historical landmark as of May 10, 1985, due to its pristine example of original craftsman architecture and its integral role in the neighborhood's development. I read the sentence again and again. The words seemed to hum with a strange energy. A historical landmark? What did that even mean, practically speaking? My fingers flew across my laptop keyboard as I searched the town's municipal code. My heart began to beat faster, a steady, hopeful rhythm against my ribs. I found it. A local ordinance. Landmark-designated properties were protected by law. They could not be significantly altered, demolished, or, and this was the part that made my breath catch in my throat, they could not be sold without the express approval and oversight of a special preservation committee. The entire premise of my family's scheme to force me to sell my house was and had always been legally impossible. The very thing they sought to destroy was protected by a power they had never even considered. It was a perfect, beautiful irony. Poetic justice. The next day, a buddy from my unit gave me a phone number. "If you're in a fight, you want her in your corner," he said. "They call her the Bulldog." Her name was Evelyn Sterling. She was a lawyer in her late 60s, a local legend. Her office, in a restored brick building downtown, smelled of strong coffee and old books. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with intimidating legal volumes. She had a short, no-nonsense haircut of steel gray hair. And when she shook my hand, her grip was firm and powerful. I sat across from her massive oak desk and laid out my entire story. I was methodical, presenting it like a mission briefing. I walked her through the initial demand, the campaign of harassment, the break-in. I handed her the folder I'd created, the screenshots of the Facebook post, the threatening texts, the logs of the incessant phone calls. I showed her the security footage of their reconnaissance mission and the chaos of the break-in. Finally, I placed the yellowed documents from the footlocker on her desk. Ms. Sterling listened to it all without interruption. Her sharp, intelligent eyes never left my face, and her expression was completely unreadable, a mask of professional neutrality. When I finished, the only sound in the room was the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. She simply nodded, a short, decisive gesture. "They made a number of mistakes," she said finally, her voice a low, confident rumble. "Very serious ones." She picked up the file of evidence I'd compiled. Criminal trespassing, felony vandalism, and the fact that this is a designated landmark elevates the severity of that charge considerably. A systematic campaign of harassment and intimidation. She looked up at me. And a clear attempt at fraudulent inducement to seize an asset. She stood and walked to the window, looking out over the town square. "You did well, Captain. Your discipline, your foresight in documenting everything. You've given me everything I need." She turned back to face me, and for the first time, I saw something flicker in her stoic expression. The barest hint of a smile touched the corner of her mouth. It was a predator's smile. "They thought they were attacking a house," she said, her voice dropping, filled with a cold, thrilling power. "They were mistaken. They attacked a fortress protected by the law." She walked back to her desk and squared the papers in front of her, a general preparing her battle plans. She looked me directly in the eye. "Captain," she said, "we're not just going to defend, we're going to attack." On the day of the court hearing, I chose my uniform with care. It was my formal Army service uniform, the one reserved for official ceremonies. The deep blue jacket was perfectly pressed, the brass buttons gleamed, and the medals on my chest felt heavy with the weight of my service. I didn't wear it to intimidate or to show off. I wore it to remind myself who I was. Captain Molly Walsh, an officer sworn to uphold the law, not a frightened victim cowering in a corner. It was my armor. My family sat across the courtroom from me, huddled together on a wooden bench. They looked diminished under the harsh fluorescent lights, stripped of their bluster and bravado. They looked haggard, angry, and small. Their lawyer, a slick man in a suit that was a size too tight, began his opening statement. He painted a tragic picture of a misunderstanding that spiraled out of control. He called it a sad family drama, his voice dripping with synthetic sympathy. He then tried to pivot, suggesting that my years of service had left me psychologically fragile, prone to exaggeration. He implied that my family's actions, while perhaps misguided, were born of a deep-seated concern for my well-being. I sat perfectly still beside Ms. Sterling, my hands folded calmly in my lap. I trusted my general, and I waited for her to command the battlefield. When it was our turn, Evelyn Sterling rose. She didn't just walk to the lectern, she took possession of the entire courtroom. She didn't just present the charges, she told a story. My story. She began not with the break-in, but with the foundation of abuse. She presented photographs of old bruises I had documented years ago, emails I had sent to a trusted friend in college detailing my father's rages. The courtroom was silent. Their lawyer jumped to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. Relevance? It speaks to a long-established pattern of intimidation and control, which is directly relevant to the defendant's motive, Ms. Sterling countered smoothly. The judge, a stern-faced woman with intelligent eyes, simply said, "Overruled. Proceed, counselor." Ms. Sterling laid out the evidence brick by brick, building an irrefutable case. She showed the court the threatening text messages from my father. She played the audio of my mother's hysterical, manipulative voicemails. She displayed the screenshot of Serafina's slanderous Facebook post on the courtroom monitors for all to see. The atmosphere grew thick with tension, but the final, devastating blow was the security camera footage. Miss Sterling dimmed the lights. "Your Honor, I would now like to present Exhibit D." The large screen flickered to life, showing the clear, damning footage from my office. The entire courtroom watched in stunned silence as my father, mother, and sister tore through my private files with a frantic, greedy energy. Then, Miss Sterling paused the video on a close-up of my father's face, his expression one of pure, unrestrained avarice as he held up a bank statement. She turned to face him where he sat at the defendant's table. Her voice was cold, sharp, and cut through the silence like a scalpel. "Does that look like concern for a daughter, Mr. Walsh?" she asked, her eyes boring into him. "Or does it look like a premeditated burglary?" He stared back, speechless, his face pale. The spell of their victim narrative was shattered. "Captain Walsh," Miss Sterling said, her voice softening slightly, "please tell the court, in your own words, when you discovered your family in your home, in that moment, what did you feel?" I rose and faced the judge, my posture erect, my voice clear and steady. I glanced briefly at my family. My mother was staring at her hands. Serafina was pale. My father was glaring, but for the first time, his glare held no power. "I didn't feel fear, Your Honor," I said. "I faced real danger in my career. What I felt in that moment was a profound sadness, a deep, hollow sorrow that the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally saw me only as an obstacle and my home only as a prize. They weren't there to reconcile. They were there to rob me." I turned my gaze to my father, who immediately looked away. And I decided in that moment that I was done letting them. My testimony, combined with the mountain of undeniable evidence, sealed their fate. The judge delivered her verdict without hesitation. They were found guilty on all counts: criminal trespassing, felony vandalism due to the historical status of the property, and criminal harassment. The sentence was read: probation for 3 years, full financial restitution for all damages, and, most importantly, a permanent restraining order was issued. They were legally forbidden from coming within 500 yards of me or my property. Forever. When the judge's gavel fell, the sound echoing through the quiet courtroom, my mother finally broke down, her sobs loud and performative. Serafina sat frozen, a statue of disbelief. My father just stared at me, his eyes burning with impotent, bottomless hatred. But I wasn't afraid of that look anymore. The monster had no more teeth. I stood, gave a respectful nod to Ms. Sterling, and walked out of the courtroom. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped out into the bright Carolina sunshine. I took a deep, clean breath of free air. I had won. Justice had been served. But as the courthouse doors swung shut behind me, the victory felt strangely hollow. The war was over, but the battlefield was my own heart, and I was left standing alone in the quiet aftermath. Repairing the house was, in some ways, harder than building it the first time. Every shattered piece of glass, every deep scratch in the hardwood floor was a physical reminder of the invasion. The ugly red letters on the wall seemed to have burned themselves into my memory. But this time, as I began the slow work of rebuilding, I wasn't alone. Mrs. Eleanor became a daily fixture, appearing each afternoon with a thermos of sweet tea and a plate of something delicious: lemon bars, oatmeal cookies, a slice of pound cake. She never stayed long, never offered unsolicited advice. She just provided a quiet, steady presence that said, I am here. On the weekends, my battle buddies from my unit showed up. They arrived in pickup trucks, armed with spackle, paint rollers, and a cooler full of beer. We put on a classic rock station, and to the sound of Led Zeppelin and Tom Petty, we worked. We patched the drywall, sanded the floors, and installed a brand new, solid oak door. The most therapeutic moment was painting over the wall where the hateful words had been. With each stroke of the roller, we erased the stain, covering the ugliness with a fresh, clean coat of hopeful blue. We worked together, surrounded by the easy banter and dark humor that soldiers share. And as we rebuilt the walls of my house, I felt the walls around my own heart begin to mend. I finally understood in the deepest part of my soul that true family isn't about shared blood. It's about shared purpose. It's about the people who show up with a hammer and a can of paint when your life has been torn apart. A year to the day after the court hearing, a letter arrived in my mailbox. It was a single, plain white envelope with no return address. But I recognized the messy, looping handwriting instantly. It was from Serafina. My first instinct was to throw it away, unopened. But curiosity got the better of me. I sat on my newly repaired porch swing and carefully opened it. Inside was a single sheet of notebook paper filled with her scrawled words. She wrote that the court-mandated therapy was surprisingly helpful. She wrote that, for the first time in her life, at 39 years old, she was working a real job, waiting tables at an Applebee's to pay her restitution and her rent. She wrote about how hard it was. The last 2 lines of the letter were simple. I'm sorry, she wrote. I'm sorry for being a terrible sister. I was blind and selfish, and I see that now. I read the letter, and for the first time in decades, I felt nothing when I thought of her. No anger, no resentment. Just a quiet, hollow emptiness. A sense of something that was broken and could never be fixed. I folded the letter, placed it inside a small wooden box where I keep old memories, and I never replied. I had learned that forgiveness is an act you do for yourself, not for the person who hurt you. It's about putting down a heavy burden so you can finally walk freely. But forgiveness does not require reconciliation. It does not mean you have to reopen a door that you closed for a very good reason. Instead of looking backward, I decided to look forward. The court had ordered my family to pay for the damages, and after Miss Sterling took her well-deserved fee, there was a small amount left over. I took that money, the final payment on a debt of pain, and I planted a seed. I partnered with a local nonprofit that helps at-risk youth and used the funds to establish a small grant program. We called it the Peaceful Fortress Fund. It's not a huge endowment. It provides small, one-time grants, enough for a security deposit on an apartment, a bus ticket out of town, or a set of tools for a trade school. For young adults who are trying to escape abusive family environments, whether by joining the military or starting a new life on their own. It was my way of taking the legacy of violence my family had tried to give me and transforming it into a legacy of hope. I couldn't save the girl in the basement, but maybe I could help someone else build their own way out. Occasionally now, I get invited to speak at veterans resource centers or domestic abuse shelters. I'm not a polished public speaker. I just tell my story. I talk about the fear, the loneliness, and the day I decided that I was worthy of peace. During a Q&A session a few months ago, a young woman asked me how I could ever truly forgive. I thought about it for a moment, and I told her about a Bible verse I'd struggled with, Matthew 5:44, the one that says, "Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." I told her I'd come to interpret it in my own way. For me, loving my enemies means wishing them peace, I said, my voice steady and clear. It means hoping, from a great and safe distance, that they find some way to heal themselves. But the greatest love you can ever give yourself sometimes is the courage to walk away. And here, in my rebuilt fortress, surrounded by the quiet hum of a life I earned and wrapped in the warmth of a family I chose, I have finally, truly found that peace. And that is my story. The story of how I built my own peaceful fortress, not of stone and wood, but of resilience. Thank you, truly, for listening and for being a part of this journey with me. My story is just one of many that will be shared on this channel, stories meant to prove that our past does not have to define our future. If you believe in the power of storytelling to heal and inspire, please subscribe so you never miss a new beginning. And consider sharing this story with just one person who might need a reminder of their own strength today.